Tape collecting's fun, but tape collecting becomes a hell of a lot more fun when you're collecting Godzilla tapes. And while it's cool to flex your large established Godzilla tape collection, there is a lot of dangerous traps and pitfalls you can fall into if you're not careful. This is Godzilla tape collecting for dummies. Before we begin, let's explain how this video will go. There are 4 tiers to Godzilla collecting: beginner, intermediate, advanced, and of course, the kaiju tier. Each tier, I'll try to give you tips and tricks to optimize and maximize your Godzilla tape collection to the fullest. We're going to begin at the beginner tier, and to enter this tier and Godzilla collecting, you need a whopping 1 Godzilla VHS tape. If you have this, congratulations, welcome to the Godzilla tape collecting world. However, before you really begin your journey, there is a very important fundamental concept of tapes that you need to know right off the bat, so you can climb the ranks very quickly. And this simple tip is the VHS 2006 rule. Basically, in majority of countries, VHS tapes stopped being produced in late 2006 to around early 2007. Some places had much later tape releases like South Korea, but what's important to know for us collecting Godzilla tapes is that we are not going to have to worry about any random dates like this, as the latest Godzilla movies that were released on VHS go up to 2004. It's also worth noting that the first VHS tapes ever made were made in the early 70s, so anything Godzilla related older than the 70s will likely be a re-release of some shape or form, but we'll get into that later on in the video. If you want to start with some easy Godzilla tapes, assuming you do not have any, then the perfect first one I feel like for any Godzilla collector is the crummy 1998 American Godzilla film. Whether you like this film or not, this is one of the easiest tapes in general to get. It was mass produced like Jurassic Park up the wazoo, so you should have little to no trouble obtaining this one. Another very easy one to get is the Godzilla Millennium or Godzilla 2000 movie. This is also a pretty common one to get, at least online. A little harder to find out in the wild, but you should have no trouble finding this one either if you want 2 very easy and simple ones to start with. Now let's talk about the intermediate tier of Godzilla tape collecting. Now Godzilla has a buttload of tapes from this time period we are working with, which we explained in the last tier. And this is where things start to become a little tricky and dangerous if we're not careful. However, in this tier, we're going to really focus on getting quantity in this situation. If you're looking to dramatically speed up the process, then I highly recommend buying 1 or 2 Godzilla tape lots. These are, as described, VHS lots of Godzilla tapes, and a lot of these can come from around 3 to over 10 plus Godzilla VHS tapes. And it is a great opportunity to save pretty good money on a large portion of them. However, there are a couple traps we have to watch out for here. One is that it's really only advised to buy 1 or 2 of these tape sets, or tape lots I should say, for specific reasons. The biggest one being you want to make sure you're not getting dupes, especially if you're just trying to get every single movie. Godzilla tapes in particular get pretty wacky and nasty when it comes to variants, which we'll explain more in the higher tiers. Funny thing about a lot of these other variations, though, I will say in this tier, is that a lot of them come from their own natural designed sets made by the companies that distribute them. So if you wanted a more aesthetically pleasing collection, then it might be in your best interest to buy a box set. And usually these are pretty cheap alternatives to getting pretty fast amounts of tapes early on. But as mentioned before, if you're trying to avoid dupes, then I'd only advise buying 1 or 2 of these, especially if you're trying to avoid dupes, like I said before, because a lot of these sets do have similar movies in them. Movies that are a tad bit more difficult to get include the original 1954 Godzilla, believe it or not, Godzilla's Revenge, and Godzilla vs. Destroyer, just to name a few. And to be honest, majority of Godzilla tapes actually end up in this tier. Especially if you don't really care about variants and all that mumbo jumbo and just looking for a copy of the film on VHS period, then this is going to be the situation in the vast majority of situations. Which means you should be able to get the vast majority of movies on VHS with no issues. Allegedly, of course. Where things begin to get trickier is when we end up in the advanced tier. Now we can finally talk about the other potential variants you can get. Now, not every movie, for the record, has a variant, but the vast majority of Godzilla movies were re-released multiple times, as a lot of them were made well before the release of VHS tapes, so this kind of made the domain easier to make alternate variants of these films. Godzilla vs. Megalon has some of the most interesting examples, as that movie seems to be favorited a lot by America for some reason, in the way that they liked to make fun of it, as there is a lost SNL skit of John Belushi in a Godzilla suit making fun of the Godzilla vs. Megalon movie. It was quite a spectacle, to say the least, so I don't blame them for thinking that. It was also one of the few films that got an OG release in America, so it was kind of the little representation people had of Godzilla in America at the time. So bear that in mind. But as mentioned earlier, it allowed for a ton of variants of this film to be released. Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster, aka Hedorah, also kind of got similar treatment and has a lot of interesting and wacky variants to it. However, if you wanted a little bit more of a sophisticated tape, then look no forward than the original Japanese releases, which is where variants can get really interesting. For starters, a lot of them have been made by similar brands, so there is a lot more uniformity and cleanliness to a lot of Japanese tapes, as there are also very wild, crazy, and really badass covers for a lot of the Godzilla movies in Japanese. It's also worth noting that some versions of Japanese Godzilla films will have English subtitles and some will not. And in every situation, the voice acting will be Japanese. What has or does not have subtitles, I'm not entirely sure. If you want to find that out, it's best looking at the eBay description and title. Usually the seller will state if there is subtitles or not. And over time, you can tell the difference between a subtitled and non-subtitled one. There's a couple ways to look at specific details, like on the tape, for example. However, things get really tricky and even more advanced in the advanced tier when we start talking about the last couple Godzilla Millennia movies. Starting specifically with Godzilla vs. Megaguirus. Now, pretty much all of these movies up to Final Wars are fairly trivial to obtain on DVD. However, when it comes to VHS, a lot of these newer movies had exclusively Japanese releases, making them rather difficult for the average consumer to obtain a copy of one of these movies on VHS, with Godzilla 2000 being one of the few exceptions to this. Now, they're not unobtainable, and especially in more modern times, more people know about them and sell them online. However, they are more expensive than the average Godzilla movie due to their rarity and more limited release. As you have to keep in mind, during this time, pretty much every big company ever was looking into releasing all their content on CDs and DVDs and not VHS. This was the last couple years of VHS being phased out, with 2006 being the nail in the coffin for the vast majority of movies, unless you're South Korea. Now, I personally believe we have found majority of Godzilla tape variants, especially for the vast majority of movies. I'm sure there are undocumented and very rare variants of movies, but at the end of the day, these are just still box cover variants of the movie. And what's more interesting to talk about is what we have to offer in the final tier of the kaiju. Now, To start this final tier, let's ask one interesting, unanswered question. Out of all of the Godzilla movies from this time period that have a physical tape in some shape or form, which one is the rarest and or most difficult one to obtain? And that question is easily answered with Godzilla Final Wars. This movie, specifically out of all the movies, even the rare late millennial releases, this one just seems to be rare on a whole nother scale. And this is likely due to it not being the biggest commercial success, and also it being near the very end of the VHS life cycle, 2004 to be exact. What's even more interesting is that this movie was typically only acquired via a X-rental copy, meaning pretty much every copy of Godzilla Final Wars on VHS is most likely an X-rental of some shape or form. I'm not sure about my copy in particular being an X-rental, but a lot of these really late releases are considered X-rentals, or at least some of the variants are. It's not really known. This tape is wildly obscure, and it took me a very long time to get my hands on one of these tapes. It is a grail in the Godzilla tape collecting world, and a grail in the VHS collecting world, period. However, when it comes to Godzilla tapes, it does not just end on Final Wars. What if I told you there is a whole undocumented universe of extremely rare, one-of-a-kind Godzilla tapes that never released to the public? This is where this tier gets really interesting. For decades, there was rumored to be a lost original title card ending to Godzilla 2000 that was poorly documented, and someone magically found an original TriStar Godzilla VHS tape, and on it truly was an original alternate title card ending variant that looks horrendously goofy, to be honest, and I can see why they changed it last minute. But it doesn't just end there for Godzilla Holy Grail tapes, as there is a rabbit hole, a separate universe, a different dimension of extremely rare and undocumented Godzilla VHS tapes. And one example I would like to bring up are the Japanese special effects VHS tapes. Now, when I first saw this tape for the first time, I thought maybe this was just a rare variant of a Godzilla VHS tape. But upon further inspection, I realized that these were not the same tapes. These were extremely rare promotional special effects tapes, which basically showcase unmastered scenes from the movie they display. This particular tape also had an extended cut of the Godzilla eye shot, along with an alternate Godzilla title card that has never been seen before. Unfortunately, there is very, and I mean very, very, very little on this series of extraordinarily rare Godzilla Millennial tapes. What I do know is I don't believe these were given out to the public. I think they were either given out via a competition or for people who actually worked on the tape, as they referred to an event called the Godzilla Roadshow. Again, another event that is poorly documented, and hopefully something can be found on what this event truly was for. But what I do know is that every Godzilla Millennial movie, besides Final Wars, has a very rare special effects variant to it. And as of making this video, majority of them are lost media. However, I do believe the Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla one might be available online, but I can't confirm if this is the same thing or not. Again, there is almost no documentation on these. I also wouldn't be surprised if there are other different types of tapes out there that are extremely rare holy grails that have yet to be discovered. But that is up for time to tell, and time will be the answer as to the fate of Godzilla VHS tapes. But if you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is actually a or technically a re-upload of a video I did 8 months ago on Godzilla VHS collecting, but I thought I would clean it up and make it a lot more professional and put together, as I just did not have these skills back in the day. So that's about it. Thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Peace.